During my high school years, there were only two things that I could think about: gaming and rapping. For the first time in my life, my parents could afford a good gaming PC. And while games themselves were still too expensive, there were totally licit means to play them for free that I have been told from credible sources. However, due to the importance and the sensitivity around the subject, I have refrained from going on it. And rapping, well, it's been a few years since I wrote my last rhymes. I may be a little too rusty. I know I have no proof, I just need you to trust me. Two things that I didn't have any interest up until this point, however, were anime and fighting games. But life can take some weird turns and suddenly stupid mistakes happened. Suddenly, I was friends with the weebs. I know, right? Terrifying stuff. In all seriousness though, at this point my circle of friends was deeply interested in anime. And whenever we showed up at each other's houses, we would play fighting games. To stop getting my ass beat for free, I started to practice fighting games by myself and eventually got deep into the genre, scouring everywhere in hopes to find hidden gems, which I did a lot of times. And also never really getting rematched from my friends because I got better than them, so there's that. For example, I only found out about series such as Melty Blood, at the time the #1 parking lot and bathroom fighting game. And my favorite series, Guilty Gear, by going out of my way and checking every single fighting game that I could. It might sound like a joke now talking about these series as non-popular, but at the time they really weren't out there. You were more likely to first stumble into Holy Orders on YouTube before you ever got to see gameplay footage of Guilty Gear. Then, with anime, I started to look into it out of curiosity because up until this point, I wasn't really fond of it. But my friends lived and breathed anime, so I thought, well, I'll give it a try, maybe I'll like it. It couldn't be that bad. I started with their recommendations and they weren't my cup of tea. I still gave them a try though and eventually found anime that I really liked, such as Ghost in the Shell, Evangelion, Cowboy Bebop, Ergo Proxy, and Serial Experiments Lane. Let's all love Lane. My friends definitely didn't share my taste, especially for Lane, at the time considered a weird anime for weird people, tagged in the dementia category on very illicit websites that totally didn't do anything wrong. For the most part, my taste was very different from my friends, and often I looked at some of their recommendations wondering to myself, why? One time, a friend of mine told me about a shonen anime about martial arts, World's Mightiest Disciple Kenichi. At first I wasn't really interested in it because a shonen about fighting didn't really seem like something that I would like, but I decided to give it a try anyway. And surprisingly, I liked it quite a bit. Looking back at it, I'm not sure if the show aged well for me, especially considering that I didn't even remember the name of most characters before checking on them for this video. But I remember that at the time, the idea of a boy finding a random dojo full of awesome masters that treated him like family felt heartwarming. It was also interesting to see the martial arts techniques being explained, and the show had its funny moments that got a laugh out of me. This is the part where I would say that since I got into fighting games, trying every fighting game I could find, and having really enjoyed watching Kenichi at the time, I found out about the Kenichi fighting game made by Capcom for the PlayStation 2, got a very illicit copy of it, looked up for info online, and got really into it. But that wasn't really what happened. For some reason, this game eluded me up until this year. How? I don't know. It surely wasn't because I didn't look for fighting games on PS2, it also wasn't because it was released only in Japan. I mean, I played even the matrimony Japanese exclusive PS2 port. And it sure wasn't because I didn't want to play a Kenichi game, I just never stumbled upon it.
Shijyou Saikyou no Deshi Kenichi! Gekitou! Ragnarok Hachikengou
is a 3D fighting game made by Capcom, based on the anime adaptation of the Kenichi manga. The series stays true to the anime visual style. It doesn't really look terrible for a 3D anime fighting game released in 2007 for the PS2 out of all consoles, but it has some very rough spots, especially when you can't unsee that the characters look like they have masks glued to their faces instead of real faces. Their sides and backs can look a little rough too, but again, at this point, most of the games that converted 2D anime characters into 3D models faced similar issues. The game features its own story mode that goes through the events that happen in the anime, the Ragnarok arc. And if you want to play any character other than Kenichi and Miu, you better beat it. Because you only unlock new characters by beating them in the story. You can also just download a save game online and cut to the chase instead, but I don't think this was the initial developer's intention. You know that this is a 2000s anime game because for some reason developers love to do this. They locked nearly every single character behind the story mode based on the events that you probably already knew about if you actually liked the anime and bought the game. It was a pointless design choice that really seemed like the standard at the time, and they only got away with it because for the most part, kids were the ones playing these games, and they really didn't care. But thank God that most fighting games don't lock characters behind some arbitrary barrier anymore. That's a thing that stayed in the past. Other than the story mode, the game features some standard fighting game modes such as time attack, mission mode, survival, and score attack, which is the traditional arcade mode. And of course it has an arcade mode, because who would release a fighting game without an arcade mode at release? This is a Capcom game, so you know it has to have one. Now, for the fighting itself, this was clearly targeted at a more casual audience. Besides being a game based on an existing franchise, it is much simpler than your average fighting game. But it still has some decent depth to it, with some mechanics that might not be too obvious for someone booting up the game for the first time. First, the inputs. By default, square is your weak attack button. Triangle is the strong attack, cross is the guard break button, which costs 1 bar to use, and circle is the counter button, which we'll get into later. This is fairly similar to the basic button inputs from Dead or Alive, with the main difference being that instead of having a block button and a throw button, Kenichi has a guard break button instead of a block button, and a counter button instead of a throw. L1 is the taunt button, R2 is the quick super button, and R1 is used to activate one of the 2 modes that you can select for your character. These modes resemble the isms of Street Fighter Alpha, or the grooves of Capcom vs SNK. There are 2 modes, Fury and Calm. Activating either of them turns the meter gauge into a timer, similarly to KOF's Max mode. And while it is active, characters gain different bonuses based on their choice. The Fury mode activation works like a Roman cancel from Guilty Gear. It can cancel a special or normal move, allowing for combo extensions. It also gives your character the ability to immediately cancel any special or normal moves into a super for combo enders, gives extra damage to the moves used during the Fury state, and allows you to use your super as many times as you want during its duration. The second mode, Calm, can be activated during block stun or hit stun, allowing it to be used as a sort of combo breaker. It heals players while active, gives a considerable defense boost, reducing damage taken, and allows them to guard cancel during block stun by inputting quarter circle forward weak attack. This turns the tables and puts the defender on a favorable situation, now able to counterattack his opponent. The game has a universal motion system, with all characters' special moves being done by doing quarter circle forward or back plus weak or strong attack, and also has built-in combos, which can be performed by mashing weak attack 4 times, or combining 2 weak attacks with 2 strong attacks for the most part. The universal motion and the combo systems were intentional from the developers, as the game was made with gamepad in mind, and they didn't want to make combos too hard to pull off. The game's combo structure isn't complicated at all, but it offers players a few creative ways to explore it. The game allows for juggle state combos, with most characters having an easily accessible launcher, and players can cancel the universal string at any point besides the last hits that knock opponents down with a special move. For most characters, this is where their combos would end, unless they have chosen the Fury mode. By activating it, they can perform yet another string, cancel it into another special move, and if that move leaves the opponent in a juggle state high enough, they can then finish it off with a super. The game's special meter is filled by hitting the opponent, taunting, or getting hit, up to a maximum of 3 bars. Supers cost 2 bars. Mode activations require the player to be at maximum resource level, and the guard breaks cost 1 meter. Blocking in Kenichi is really simple. It's automatic. As long as the player isn't pressing buttons, they block attacks. Because of this, high, mid, and low attacks work different than in most 3D games. Instead of beating blocking options, they work as a rock paper scissors system, with each one of them for the most part beating each other. The counter button is an important part of Kenichi. Players can perform counters by pressing circle while their opponents are attacking. If successful, an animation will play out where they throw away and turn around their opponents for moderate damage. Just counters are performed nearly at the exact time that the opponent throws out an attack, and rewards players with more damage while also keeping their opponents closer for better pressure after knockdown. Counters can be beat with throws or by throwing off your opponent with different timings, as the universal strings can be delayed for up to 59 frames, enabling a potentially interesting mind game. Other mechanics that the game has are the guard break, which is a fairly slow attack that if your opponent is doing it, you must either evade it or hit him out of it, and is an attack that has great hit stun values, enabling any follow-ups that the attacker might wish for. Tacking, with which characters can get up earlier when knocked down by pressing any button plus a direction. Taunts, which are actually useful as they generate 1 bar immediately, even if you're hit out of them. Clashing, which really doesn't do a lot in this game, it just looks cool. And throws, that can be performed by pressing strong attack plus forward or back, and despite being fairly slow, can have some insane range values. One thing that this game did really well was adapting the characters of the series into fighting game characters. Kenichi and Miu are beginner-friendly characters, with Kenichi having a more basic and concise kit, and Miu feeling like a more confusing character but nonetheless fun. Ryuto is an incredibly fun combo machine with multiple juggle follow-ups and long combos. Hermit has good reach for most of his moves and his animations look great and impactful. Siegfried is an incredibly animated weirdo with a Janshi stance, breakdancing, and Presiadic all in one kit. Valkyrie was the character that I had the most fun playing with. She's the resident Taekwondo Super Kicker character, with sidestep sway motions putting Nina's crab walk to shame. Freya fights with her staff and controls the range better than anyone in the roster. Her moves resemble Billy Kane's and she learned how to grab people with Marth. Overall, the roster is really fun and feels like it was really well thought out. except for 3 characters: Loki, Nijima, and number 20. Number 20 is very similar to Loki. The developers even put her as a secret character that you can choose by pressing square when you're about to choose Loki. So instead of talking about both, I'll just talk about him because they share pretty much the same problems. Loki is a character that unfortunately suffers from having to deal with a terrible power-up gimmick. There are many characters in fighting games that rely on power-ups that stack and are unsafe to use on neutral. Generally, developers give them the tools to enable them to effectively knock down their opponents in multiple ways to be able to safely stack their power-ups to enable their true potential. Their gameplay tends to start off really slow and methodical to then be able to go wild on their opponents. Loki follows this power-up character archetype, but everything about him feels awkward. He's clunky slow and his damage is really low until he reaches his 5 stacks. Being forced to repeat the move, even when you don't really want to use it, as an investment for the future of the match 5 times is too much. Generally, the golden rule is 3 times. More than that, and the player is probably better off playing a different character at that point. Even though his power-ups carry over rounds, it's still way too slow. But clearly, this is just a mistake that happened during the experimental era of Capcom. And this would never happen again. No one would commit this mistake again, especially Capcom, right? Nijima is a joke character, so you know how this goes. His tools are just straight up weird, playing with the idea of him manipulating and controlling his opponent. And his moves have really slow startups and really janky hitboxes. Just look at this. Realistically, after someone has seen this happen once, your odds of landing some of these moves drop down drastically. And even if they didn't see it coming, you better line this up perfectly, otherwise you're done. If that wasn't enough, he super damages himself and gives no real benefits in return. Self-damage in fighting games is something that only works when the character has upside to basically helping his opponent defeat him, and or ways to mitigate their losses. Spending 2 bars at least to do average damage, take self-damage, and possibly lose a round doesn't look like a good trade. Despite these 3 exceptions, the game characters, like I said before, feel good to play and are the strong point of the game. The stages are overall pretty good as well for the most part. They are meant to be scenarios from the series. Some are a bit bland, others are more visually appealing. For the most part, they have some stage hazards, but these hazards generally don't really interfere that much with the fighting. Except for one stage. The train stage was undeniably a mistake. I get it that they were trying to replicate the Kenichi and Hermit fight on top of a moving train, but in a game with so much wall carry and knockback on a lot of moves, most matches on this stage are extremely one-sided. Once one side gets a hit in, the round is theirs. This stage is so unbalanced and poorly thought out that it's hilarious. The highest point of the stages, however, comes in the form of the music of the game. There are some absolute bangers in here that unfortunately aren't as well known as they deserve to be. And this is due to the game's fate of being forgotten. And this brings us into the question that is the whole point of this series. But why was this game forgotten? There are many factors to why this game was forgotten. The most important one is probably the fact that the IP that it is based on was never really that popular to begin with. World's Mightiest disciple Kenichi is a series that even during its prime wasn't as huge as a phenomenon as other anime. It was a fairly niche shonen manga that went under the radar for most people in the West and is honestly easily forgettable. Like I said before, if it wasn't for this video, I wouldn't remember nearly none of the names of these characters, and I only remember most of the events that happened in this series as I went through the stages in the arcade mode of this game. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be able to tell what happened in it either. If anything, I remember more about the masters that show up in the intro, but don't really show up as playable in-game, than any other thing about this series. The second factor is that this game was exclusively released in Japan, during the dark age of Capcom fighting games, after Capcom Fighting Gen made it seem like it was over for them. Not only you can't find copies of it outside of Japan, but it is also easy for people who find out about it to dismiss it and never really give it a try. Especially taking into consideration that this was during the time that the fighting arena anime games such as Dragon Ball Budokai and Naruto Ninja Storm were extremely popular. So seeing that this is a 3D fighting game made by Capcom, who mostly stuck with 2D fighting games and was doing really badly in fighting games during that time, could rub people the wrong way. The third factor is that while the game stays true to the fighting game genre, it isn't as complex as most fighting games. So not only it is targeted at a niche market, it really isn't all that appealing to the hardcore FGC heads. And one problem that the fighting game genre has is that if your game doesn't have a community built around it, it is doomed to be forgotten. No one will talk about it, and no one will run tournaments for it, leaving it in a limbo, forgotten. Guides and discussions that you find about this game have been inactive for over 13 years at this point. The final factor is that it was released only for the PS2 during the sunset of the console's lifespan. By 2007, the PS3 was already out, and this was when we saw some of the first considerable graphic leaps in a decade. With a new generation of consoles already taking over the market, and fighting games, not only Capcom's, being at an all-time low, it is nearly impossible to imagine that someone would lose their minds over a Kenichi fighting game made by Capcom at the time. Overall, World's Mightiest Disciple Kenichi Ragnarok is still a solid, fun fighting game that thankfully can be experienced easily as of today thanks to the power of emulation. But it suffered heavily from many unfavorable circumstances during its release, making it fall into the realm of forgotten games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.